Is that just me, or is my chat window not in the right place? Anyway, I'm not sure why that would change, but it looked like it was off the screen on my monitor. Like my format got altered somehow. I don't know why it would have. Hello? And is my stream really lagging that badly compared to what I'm seeing? That's weird. Why does my format seem like it's changed? I haven't done any adjustments to it. Anyway. Welcome in. It is Thursday night. So we are going to be doing some more Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. I hope everyone can hear me alright. My microphone says... where is it? Where's my microphone? Hello? Okay, there's my microphone. It's saying my microphone's actually coming up low this time. How does this happen when I don't change any of my settings? I mean, really? I'm gonna check stuff, because this is weird that it would just randomly change on me. I haven't changed any of the settings on my computer, but my stream settings have changed. It's like Windows still has my microphone up to full. Is it just the placement that changed? That's weird. I don't think any of the filters have changed on it. Guess I can boost the gain a little. Because I don't want to boost the gain too much, because then I'll just be too loud, and then it'll just be more annoying. Of course, I'm also hearing background noise again, so I'll have to fix that. Okay, now I don't hear the background noise as much. Put the gain up a little bit more. There we go. Okay, now I'm still in the yellow. Huh. What changed? How does my system change without me actually doing anything is beyond me. I know I changed my microphone position slightly. Move it a little bit more. As I aimed my microphone a little bit more towards me, so I'm crossing more of the field on it. Okay, well, it's still just peeking me out in the yellow, which I guess is a good thing. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and go over to the study and hopefully start some stories. And you notice I have added the cat cam to the study scene. However, there are no cats on scene right now. Because cats are unpredictable at best, annoying at worst. Okay, OBS so it's already showing me on the next scene, but the stream is still showing me the library and the bookstore. Okay, now it just now switched over to where I can see that I'm in the study. Anyway, we are reading stories tonight. And if you remember, last week we were introduced to the good Professor Van Dusen. Okay. We had a partial story explaining the good professor and why he got the title The Thinking Machine. And then we went into his first official, well, not his first official case, but the first case that we were introduced for him. So tonight, we're going to do the second one, which I'll get into. So please settle in for some interesting attempts at voice acting and general book narration. I have lemonade and it's not helping my throat any. Oh, it's very lemony. Okay, page. Okay, that's the first page. So our first story for tonight, Professor Von Dusen's Problems by Jacques Futrelle. Number 2, The Missing Necklace. Decidedly, Mr. Branley Cunningham Leighton was clever. His most ardent enemies admitted that. Scotland Yard, for instance, not only admitted it, but insisted on it. It was not any half-hearted insistence either, for in the words of Herbert Conway, one of the Yard's chief operators, he was smooth. So smooth that he made ice feel like sandpaper. Whether or not Mr. Leighton was aware of this delicate compliment does not appear. It was perfectly possible that he was, although he had never mentioned it. He was a well-bred gentleman, and aware of many things that he never mentioned. In his person, Mr. Leighton had the distinguished honor of closely resembling an immaculate villain of melodrama. In his mental attainments, however, Scotland Yard gave him credit for being a genius, far beyond the cigarette-smoking mummer of crime, who is always transparent and is inevitably caught. Mr. Leighton has never been caught. Perhaps that is why Scotland Yard insisted on his cleverness and was prepared to argue the point. Mr. Leighton went everywhere, and those gatherings were the highest in the social world met. There was Mr. Leighton. He was on every matron's selected list of guests, a charming addition to any assembly. Scotland Yard knew this. Of course, it may have only been the merest chance that he was always present at those gatherings where valuable jewels had been lost or mislaid. Yet Scotland Yard did not regard it as chance. That it did not was another compliment to Mr. Leighton. From deep down on its innermost conscience, Scotland Yard looked up to Mr. Leighton as a mastermind, if not the actual vital instrument in a long series of baffling jewel robberies. There was a fitness and delicacy. Let me try that again. There was a finesse and delicacy, not to mention regularity, about those robberies that annoyed Scotland Yard. Yet, believing all this, Scotland Yard had never been so indiscreet as to mention the latter to Mr. Leighton. As a matter of fact, Scotland Yard had never seen its way clear to mentioning it to anyone. Conway had some ideas on his own about Mr. Leighton, whom he exalted to a position that he would have surprised if not flattered him. Conway perhaps more nearly expressed the opinion of Scotland Yard in a few brief remarks than I could greater length. "Here's a crook, and the cleverest in the world," he said to Mr. Leighton, almost enthusiastically. "He's got a Hemingway jewel, the Clennington bracelet, and the quick shiners all right. I know he got them, but that doesn't do any good, merely knowing it. I can't put a finger on him because he's too smooth. I think I've got him, and then I haven't." This was before the Varon necklace affair. When that remarkable episode came to be known to Scotland Yard, Conway's admiration for Mr. Leighton increased immeasurably. He knew that Leighton was the responsible one. He knew it in his head and heart, but that was all. He gnawed his scrubby mustache fiercely and set to work to prove it, before feeling that it was a vain task. The absolute simplicity of the thing, and in this it is like all others, was the most puzzling feature. Lady Varon had given a reception to the United States ambassador at her London house. She had gathered about her a most distinguished company. There were representatives of England, France, and Russia. There were some of the most beautiful women on the continent. There were 2 American duchesses. There were a chosen few of the American colony, and Mr. Leighton. It may have well been to repeat that he went everywhere. Lady Varon was on this occasion wore the famous Varon necklace. Its intrinsic value is said to have been £40,000. Associations made it priceless. She was dancing with the American ambassador when she slipped on the smooth floor and fell, dragging him down with her. It was an undignified, unromantic thing, but it happened. Mr. Leighton chanced to be one of the nearest and rushed to her assistance. In an instant, Lady Varon and the ambassador were on the center of the little group. It was Mr. Leighton who helped Lady Varon to her feet. "It's nothing," she assured him, smiling uncertainly. "I was a little awkward, that's all." Mr. Leighton turned to assist the ambassador, but found him standing again and puffing inordinately, then turning back to Lady Varon. "You dropped your necklace," he remarked blandly. "My necklace?" Lady Varon's white hand flew to her bare throat, and she paled a little as Mr. Leighton and the others of the group stood back and took in for the jewels. It was not to be seen. Lady Varon controlled herself admirably. "It must have fallen somewhere," she said finally. "Are you sure you had it on?" asked another guest solicitously. "Oh, yes," she replied positively, "but I may have dropped it somewhere else." "I noticed it just before we fell," said the ambassador. "It must be here." But it was not. In that respect, that is, visible non-existence, it resembled the Shetland bracelet. Mr. Leighton had, on that occasion, strolled out on the lawn at night with the Honourable Miss Cheltenham, and she dropped the bracelet. That was all. It was never found. In this Varon affair, it would be useless to go into details of what immediately followed the loss of the necklace. It was sufficient to say that it was not found, that men and women stared at each other in bewilderment, embarrassed, and mutual suspicion, and that finally Mr. Leighton stood still beside Lady Varon, intimidated courteously, tactfully, that a personal search of the guests would not be amiss. He did not say it in so many words, but the others understood. Mr. Leighton was seconded heartily by the American ambassador, a democratic individual with honest ideas which were foremost when a question of personal integrity was involved. But the search was not made, and the reception proceeded. Lady Varon bore her loss marvelously well. "She's a brick," was the audible compliment of one of the American duchesses, whose father owned £47 million worth of soap somewhere in vague America. It was not until the next day that Scotland Yard was notified of Lady Varon's loss. "Leighton there?" was Conway's first question. "Yes." "Then he got it," Conway asserted positively. "I'll get him this time, or I know why." Yet, at the end of the month, he neither had him, nor did he know why. He had intercepted messengers, he had opened letters, telegrams, cable dispatches, he had questioned servants, he had taken advantage of the absence of both Mr. Leighton and his valet to search his exquisite apartments. He had done all these things and more, all that a severely conscientious man of his profession could do, and had gnawed his scrubby mustache down to the disreputable ragged line. But of the necklace there was no clue, no mention, no trace, nothing. Then Conway heard that Mr. Leighton was going to the United States for a few months. "To take the necklace and dispose of it," he declared, out of his vexation of his own heart. "If he ever gets abroad with it, I've got him. Either I've got him, or United States customs officials will have him." Conway could not bring himself to believe that Leighton, with all his cleverness, would dare try to dispose of the pearls in England, and he flattered himself that he could not have sent them elsewhere. Too close a watch had been kept. It transpired naturally that when the Boston-bound liner Romani sailed from Liverpool 4 days later, not only was Mr. Leighton aboard, but Conway was there. He knew Leighton, but he was secure in the thought that Leighton did not know him. On the second day out, he was disabused on this point. He was beginning to think that it might not be a bad idea to know Leighton casually, so when he noticed that the immaculate gentleman was alone, leaning on the rail, smoking, he sauntered up and joined him in contemplation of the infinite ocean. "Beautiful weather," Conway remarked after a long time. "Yes," replied Leighton, as he glanced around and smiled. "I should think you Scotland Yard men would enjoy a junket like this." Conway did not as much foolish thing as start or show astonishment, whatever he might have felt. Instead, he smiled pleasantly. "I've been working pretty hard on that Varon affair," he said frankly, "and now I'm taking a little vacation." "Oh, that thing of Lady Varon's?" inquired Leighton lazily. "Indeed, I happened to be the one to notice the necklace was gone." "Yes, I know," responded Conway grimly. The conversation drifted to other things. Conway found Leighton an agreeable companion and a democratic one. They smoked together, walked together, and played shuffleboard together. That evening Leighton took a hand at bridge in the smoking room. For hours Conway stared at the phosphorescent points on the sinister green waters and smoked. If he did it," he remarked at last, "he's the cleverest scoundrel on earth, and if he did not, I'm the biggest fool." 6 bells, 11 o'clock, struck. The deck was deserted. Conway stumbled through along the dark toward the smoking room. Inside he saw Leighton still at play. As he paused at the open door, he heard Leighton's voice. "I'll play until 2 o'clock, not later," he said. Conway made up his mind instantly. He turned and retraced the steps along the deck to Leighton's room, where he stopped. He knew Leighton had not burdened himself with a valet, and thought he knew why, so without hesitation he drew out several keys and fumbled at the lock. It yielded at last, and he stepped inside the stateroom, closing the door. His purpose was instantly apparent. It was to search. Now Conway had his own ideas just how far a search should be conducted. First, he took out all of Leighton's wearing apparel and patted and pinched inch by inch. He squeezed the neckties, unrolled handkerchiefs, examined shirts, and crumpled up silken hosiery. Then he took the shoes, half a dozen pairs. He had been suspicious of shoes once since he had found a dozen diamonds concealed in a fake heel, but these heels were not false. Next, still without haste or apparent disappointment, he turned his attention to the handbag and the steamer trunk, both of which he had emptied. Such things had been known to have false bottoms or secret compartments. These had none. He satisfied himself absolutely on this point by every method known to his art. In due time, his examination came down to the room itself. He unmade the bed and closely felt and scrutinized the mattress, sheets, blankets, pillows, and coverlet. He took the 3 drawers from the dressing cabinet and looked behind them. He turned over several newspapers and shook them one by one. He peered into the water jug and fumbled around the plumbing in the tiny bathroom adjoining. He examined the carpet to see if anything had been hidden beneath it. Finally, he climbed on a chair and from his elevated position looked into a crack or crevice where the necklace or unset pearls could be hidden. There are still 3 possibilities, he told himself at the end, as he carefully restored the room to its previous condition. He might have left them in a package in the ship's safe, but that's improbable, too risky. He might have left them in the trunk in the hold, which is still more improbable. Or he might have them on his person. That is more than likely. So Conway went out, extinguishing the light and locking the door behind him. He stepped into his own stateroom a moment and took a mouthful of whiskey, which he spat out again. But it must have been some deep, potent effect, for a few minutes later, when he appeared in the smoking room, he was in a lamentable state of intoxication and exhaled whiskey noticeably. In his maudlin, thick-tongued condition, Leighton glanced up at him with a well-bred reproach. It may have been only accident that Conway stumbled over Leighton's feet and noted that he wore flat-soled, loose slippers without heels, and also the accident that he embraced him with exaggerated affection as he struggled to recover his equilibrium. Be those things as they may, Leighton excused himself good-naturedly from the bridge party and urged Conway to bed. Conway would only agree on condition that Leighton would assist him. Leighton consented cheerfully, and they left the smoking room together, Conway clinging to him as the vine to the oak. Halfway down the deck, Conway stumbled and fell, despite the friendly supporting arm, and in his effort to save himself, his hand slid all the way down Leighton's shapely legs. Then they deposited in his stateroom, and Leighton returned to his cards, smiling. "And he hasn't got them on him," declared Conway enigmatically to the bare walls. "He was not intoxicated now." It was an easy matter next day for him to learn that Leighton had left nothing in the ship's safe, and that his 4 trunks in the hold were inaccessible, being buried under hundreds of others. Whereupon Conway sat down to wait and learn what new and original ideas of searching Uncle Sam's customs officers had invented. At last came a morning when the wireless telegraph operator aboard picked up a signal from shore and announced that the Romantic was less than 100 miles from Boston Light. Later, Conway found Leighton leaning on the rail, smoking and gazing shoreward. It was 3 hours or so after that several passengers noticed a motorboat coming toward them. Leighton watched it with idle interest. Finally, it circled widely, and it became apparent that it was coming alongside the slow-moving liner. When it was only 100 feet off, the liner was barely creeping along. Leighton grew suddenly interested. "By Jove!" he exclaimed, and shouted, "Hello, Harry!" "Hello, Leighton!" came the answering shout. "Heard you were aboard and came out to meet you." There was a rapid fire of uninteresting pleasantries as the motorboat slid in under the Romantic's lee and bobbed up and down in her wash. The man aboard stood up with a package of newspapers in his hand. "Here are all the American papers for you," he called. He flung the bundle, and Leighton caught it, left the rail, and passed into his stateroom. He returned after a moment with a bundle of English papers, those Conway had previously seen. "Catch!" he called. "There's something in these that will interest you." The man in the small boat caught the package and dropped it carelessly on a seat. Then suddenly, Conway awoke. "There goes the necklace," he told himself with a start. A quick, grasping movement of the hands attracted the attention of Leighton, who smiled inscrutably daring into the blazing eyes of the Scotland Yard man. The motorboat, with a parting shout of, "I'll meet you at the wharf," sped away. Thoughts began to flow rapidly through Conway's fertile brain. 5 minutes later, he burst onto the wireless operator and sent a long dispatch to the officials ashore. Then, from the bow rail, he watched the motorboat speeding away in the direction of Boston. It drew off about 2 miles and remained relatively in that position for nearly all 40 miles into Boston Harbor. It spoke to no other craft, passed near none, in fact, while in Conway's sight, which was until it disappeared in the harbor. An hour later, the Romantic was warped in and tied up. Conway was first man off, and he went straight to a man who seemed to be waiting for him. "Welcome in, guilty." "Did you search the motorboat?" he demanded. "Yes," was the reply. "We nearly tore it to pieces, even took it out of the water. We also searched the man on her, Harry Cheshire. You must have been mistaken." "Are we sure he spoke to no one and got rid of the jewels to another vessel?" "She didn't go near another vessel," was the reply. "I met her at my launch in the harbor mouth and came in with her." For an instant, Conway's face showed disappointment. Then came animation again. He was just beginning to get really interested in the affair. "Do you know the customs officer in charge?" he asked. "Yes." "Introduce me." There was an introduction, and the three men spoke aside for several minutes. The result of it was that when Leighton sauntered down the gangplank, he was invited into a private office. He went smilingly and submitted to a search of his person without anger or the slightest trace of uneasiness. As he came out, Conway was standing at the door. "Are you satisfied?" Leighton asked. "No," blazed Conway savagely. "What? Not after searching me twice and in my stateroom?" Conway did not answer. He did not dare to at the moment, but he stood when Leighton's 4 trunks were taken from the hold, and he saw that they were searched with the same minute care that he had given to the stateroom. At the fruitless end of it, he sat down on one of the trunks and stared at Leighton in a long sort of admiration. Leighton stared back for a moment, smiled, nodded pleasantly, and strolled up on the dock, chatting carelessly with Harriet Cheshire. Conway made no attempts to follow them. It was not worthwhile. Nothing was worthwhile anymore. "But he did get them, and he's got them now," he said to himself savagely. "Or he's disposed of them in some way I can't find." The thinking machine, Professor von Dusen, did not seem to regard the problem as at all difficult when it came to his attention a couple of days later. Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, brought it to him. Hatch had some good friends in the customs office where Conway had told his story. He learned from them that the office had refused to have anything to do with the case, insisting that Scotland Yard man must be mistaken. Crushed in spirit, mangled in reputation, and taunted by Leighton's final words, Conway took a desolate view of life. Momentarily he lost even the bulldog tenacity which had never before faltered. It lost it all in so far as he believed that Leighton was the man. It was about this time Hatch met him. Would he talk? He was burning to talk. Caution was a senseless thing anymore. Then Hatch took him eagerly by the hand and led him to the thinking machine. Conway unburdened himself at length with a vitriolic emphasis. For an hour he went on, while the scientist leaned back in his chair with his great yellow head pillowed on a cushion and squinted aggressively at the ceiling. At the end of an hour, the thinking machine knew as much of Varen's problem as Conway knew, and knew as much of Leighton as any man knew, except Leighton.
How many stones were in the necklace? The scientist asked.
172, replied Conway.
Was the man in the motorboat, Harry Cheshire you call him, an Englishman?
Yes, in speech, manner, and appearance. For a long time the thinking machine twiddled his fingers, while Conway and the reporter sat staring at him impatiently. Hatch knew, from the past, that something tangible, something that led somewhere, would come from that wonderful analytical brain. Conway, not knowing, was only hopefully curious. But like most men of his profession, he wanted action. Sitting down and thinking did not seem to be any good.
You see, Mr. Conway, said the scientist at last, you haven't proven anything. Your investigations, as a matter of fact, indicate that Leighton did not take the pearls, therefore did not bring them with him. There is only one thing that indicates he might have, and that is the throwing of the newspapers into the motorboat. That one act seems to have been a senseless one, unless...
Unless the pearls were concealed in the bundle, interrupted the Scotland Yard man.
Unless he was amusing himself at your expense and is perfectly innocent, added the thinking machine. It is perfectly possible that if he were innocent and discovered that you suspected him, he has merely made a fool of you. If we take any other view of it, we must base it on the assumption that he has known the fact to support it. We shall have to dispose of every other person who might have stolen the necklace and pin it down to Leighton. Further, we will have to assume out of hand that he brought the jewels to this country.
The Scotland Yard man was getting interested.
That is not good logic, yet when we assume that all this present purposes of the problem is a simple one, and by assuming it, we prove that our search of the stateroom was not thorough. Did you, for instance, happen to look in the underside of the slats of the berth? Do you know that the necklace, or its unset pearls, did not hang down in the drain pipe in the water bowl?
Conway snapped his fingers in annoyance. These were two things he had not done.
There are other possibilities, of course, resumed the thinking man. Therefore, the search for the necklace was useless. Now we must take for granted that if they came to this country at all, they came in one of those places you overlooked. Obviously, Mr. Leighton would not have left them in the trunks on the hold. Therefore, we must assume further that he hid them in his stateroom and threw them into the motorboat. In the event that they were in the motorboat when it left the Romantic, and we must believe that they were not in it when it docked, yet the motorboat neither spoke nor approached any other vessel. The jewels were not thrown into the water. The man Cheshire could not have swallowed 172 pearls, or any great part of them. Therefore, what have we?
Nothing, responded the Conway. That's the matter. I've had to give it all up.
Instead of nothing, we may have the answer, replied the thinking machine tartly. Let's see. Perhaps I can give you the name and address of the man who has the jewels now, assuming, of course, that Leighton brought them.
He rose suddenly and passed into the adjoining room. Conway turned and stared at Hutch inquiringly with a queer expression on his face. Is he anything of a kind of joker? He answered. No, he's a good deal of a wonder, replied Hatch. Do you mean to say that I have been working on this thing for months and months without learning anything about it, and he's got all he's got to do is go in there and get the name and address of the man who has the necklace? Demanded Conway in bewilderment. If he went into that room, and he'd bring back the Pacific Ocean in a teacup, I'd believe him, said the reporter. I know him. They were interrupted by the tinkling of a telephone bell in the next room. Then for a long time they heard the subdued hum of the scientist's irritable voice as he talked into the instrument. It was 25 or 30 minutes before he appeared in the door again. He paused there, scribbled something on a card, which he handed to Hatch. The reporter read, Henry C. H. Manderling, Scituate, Mass.
There's the name and address for the man who probably has the jewels now, said the thinking machine, quiet as a matter of fact. Mr. Hatch, you accompany Mr. Conway and let him see the surroundings, and act as if his judgment dictates. You must search this man's house. I don't think you'll have much trouble. The pearls will be unset, and you will find them possibly in small oil silk bags, not so large as your little finger. Then you find them, take steps to apprehend both this man and Leighton. Call Detective Mallory when you get to them, and bring them here.
But, stammered Conway. Come on, commanded Hatch, and Conway went. The sleepy little old town of Scituate sprawls along 2 or 3 miles of Massachusetts coast, facing the sea boldly in a series of cliffs which rise up and sink away at the utmost suddenness. The town was settled 200 or 300 years ago, and nothing has ever happened there since. It was here, on top of one of the cliffs, that Henry C.H. Manderling had lived alone for 2 or 3 months. He had gone there in the spring with other city folk with a dream of summers away, and occupied a queer little dwelling through which the salt breezes wandered at will. A tiny barn was attached to the house. Hutchinson Hatch and the Scotland Yard man found the house without difficulty, and entered it without hesitation. There was no one at hand to stop them, or to interfere with the search they made. A simple lock on the door was no obstacle. In less than half an hour, the skillful hands of the Scotland Yard man had turned out a score or more of small oil silk bags, no larger than his little finger, and tore one open, and 6 pearls fell into his hand. "They're the Varan pearls, all right," he exclaimed triumphantly after an exclamation, and dropped them all in his pocket. "Shh!" warned Hutch suddenly. He had heard the step at the door, then 2 voices, as someone inserted a key into the lock. After a moment the door opened, and crouching back in the shadow they heard 2 men enter. It was just at that psychological moment that Conway stepped out and faced them. "I want you, Leighton," he said calmly. Hatch could not see beyond the Scotland Yard man, but he heard a shot, and the bullet whistled uncomfortably close to his head. Conway leaped forward. Hatch saw his arm swing, and one of the men fell. Then another shot. Conway staggered a little, took another step forward, and swung again his great right arm. There was a scurrying of feet, the clatter of a revolver on the floor, and the front door slammed. "Tie up that chap there," commanded Conway. He opened the door, and Hatch heard him run along the veranda and leap off. He turned his attention to the senseless man on the floor. It was Harry Cheshire. A blow to the point of the chin had rendered him unconscious. Hatch bound him hand and foot where he lay, and ran out. Conway was racing down a cliff to where a motorboat lay. Hatch saw a man climb into the boat, and an instant later it shot out into the water. Conway ran to where it had been. It was now 50 yards out. "This is not time, Mr. Conway," came Leighton's voice as the boat sped up. The Scotland Yard man stared after it a moment or two, and then returned to Hatch. The reporter saw that he was pale, very pale. "Did you bind him?" Conway asked. "Yes. Are you wounded?" "Yes," replied the Scotland Yard man. "Hit me in the fleshy part of my left arm. I never knew him to carry a revolver before. It's lucky for these 2 shots were all they had." Thank you for the hydrate. The thinking machine put the finishing touches on the binding of Conway's wound. It was trivial. Then he turned to his other visitors. These were Harry Cheshire, or Manderling, and Detective Mallory, to whom he had delivered the prisoner to be on the arrival of Hatch and Conway in Boston. A general alarm had been sent out for Leighton. Conway apparently did not care anything about the wound, but he had a frank curiosity as to what the thinking machine had done, or how those things had been brought to pass.
"It was ridiculously simple," began the scientist at his explanation. "It came down to this. How could 172 pearls be transferred from a boat 40 miles at sea in a safe place ashore? The motorboat did not speak or approach any other vessel. Obviously, one could not throw them ashore. and I have never heard of such a thing as trained fish might be brought and them. Now, what is the only other thing that could have reached the shore with comparative safety?
He looked from one to the other inquiringly. In turn, each shook their head. Manderling or Cheshire was silent.
There is only one possible answer, said the scientist at last. That it was birds, homing pigeons.
By Jove! Exclaimed Conway as he stared at Manderling. And I did notice a dozen of them in the place in Situate.
The jewels were on the ship as you suspected, resumed the scientist. Unset and probably suspected in a long oil silk bag in the drain pipe I mentioned. They were thrown in the motorboat, wrapped with newspapers. 2 miles away from the Romantic, they were fastened to the homing pigeons, and one by one the pigeons were released. You, Mr. Conway, could not see the boat clearly at the distance, or you would not possibly have seen a bird rise from it. The birds went to their home, Mr. Manderling's place in Skitchett. Homing pigeons are generally kept in automatically closing up compartments, and each pigeon was locked up as it arrived. Mr. Manderling there and Mr. Leighton removed the pearls at their leisure. Of course, the homing pigeons as a clue we could get somewhere.
The thinking machine went on after a moment.
There are numerous homing pigeon associations and fanciers, and it was possible that one of these would know an Englishman who had, say, 25 or 50 birds, and presumably lived somewhere near Boston. One did know, and he gave me the name of C.H. Manderling. Harry is a corruption of Henry, and Henry C. is Henry Cheshire, or Harry Cheshire. The name Mr. Wanderley gave me when he searched at the wharf.
Can you explain how Lawton was able to get the necklaces in the first place? Asked Conway curiously.
Just as he got the other things, replied the thinking machine, by boldness and cleverness. Suppose when Lady Verne fell, Leighton had had the stout elastic fabric fastened high up on his shoulder, say, inside his coat sleeve. On the end of the elastic, with a clamp of some sort, he was drawn down on the elastic and taut and fastened to his cuff. Remember that this man was always waiting for an opportunity, and was always prepared to take advantage of it. Of course, he did not plan the thing as it happened. Suppose that the necklace had dropped off as he leaned over to help Lady Verne. In a momentary excitement, he could, as he leaned over to help Lady Verne, under the very noses, have fastened the clamp to the necklace, and instantly the jewels would have disappeared up his sleeve. Or he could have submitted to any sort of perfunctory search of his pockets as he suggested.
That's a trick of professional gamblers to get rid of the cards, remarked Detective Mallory.
Oh, it isn't you, then? Asked the thinking machine. Immediately, he left the ballroom and hid the necklace as he had hidden the other jewels, and before you, Mr. Conway, knew the thief, wrote the mail in full directions to Mr. Manderling here what to do. You did not interrupt any letters, of course, until after you knew this was theft. Leighton had perhaps had other dealings with Mr. Manderling in other parts of the world, and when he was not so closely watched in this particular case, I dare say, however, he had them all planned carefully for fear that this very thing would happen in this one case.
Half an hour later, Conway shook hands with the thinking machine, thanked him heartily, and his little party dispersed. "I'd given up," Conway confessed as he was going out.
You see, remarking the thinking machine, gentlemen of your profession use too little common sense. Remember that 2 and 2 always make 4. Not sometimes, but all of the time.
Leighton has not yet been caught. Manderling made a model prisoner. Okay. Homing pigeons to smuggle jewels back to shore.
Okay, that works.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick break here before we get into the next story.
Because honestly, the thinking machine's voice is rather irritating to try to do. I think I only have. Let me check to see. Oh, good lord! I have 4 more stories from this one character.
Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna take a break. Hope you all get up, stretch, do that kind of stuff. Okay? Okay. Did you get up? Did you stretch? Are you good? Are you guilty? Yeah. Hey, Taka.
Okay, I wondered if she was going to do the full thing.
Welcome back. I'm doing good. Getting one of those
Fun characters that I have to do a lot of particular voice for whenever he's explaining things.
What? Why am I getting another ad thing? What the hell? Why did I just get a notification that ads were about to start when I've already finished them? Oh. Professor von Dusen is definitely an interesting character.
It's always strange when I have to do voices like this, especially when an entire story depends on this one character.
Like, let's see if I can find the description of him, because... Oh, where is it? Someone actually drew a picture of him that's in the book, but it doesn't quite picture how I see him. Oh well. Anyway, I can get my headphone cable out from under the book. I'll get into the next story. Professor von Dusen's Problems by Jacques Futrelle. Number 3. The Green-Eyed Monster. With coffee cup daintily poised in one hand, Mrs. Langard van Safford lifted wistfully, bewitching eyes towards her husband, who sat across the breakfast table, particularly immersed in the morning paper. "Are you going out this morning?" Mr. Van Safford grunted inarticulately. "May I inquire," she went on placidly, through dimple snuggled at her corner of her mouth, "if that particular grunt means that you are or are not?" Mr. Van Safford lowered his newspaper and glanced at his wife's pretty face. She smiled charmingly. "Really, I beg your pardon," he apologized. "I hardly think I shall go out. I feel rather listless, and I must write some letters." "Why?" "Oh, nothing particularly," she responded. She took the last sip of her coffee and brushed 2 or 3 tiny crumbs from her lap and laid her servlettes aside and rose. Once she turned and glanced back, Mr. Van Safford was reading again. After a while, he finished the papers and stood looking out the window, yawning prodigiously at the prospect of letters to be written. His wife entered and picked up her handkerchief, which she had fallen beside her chair. He merely glanced around. She was dressed for the street, immaculately gowned as only a young and beautiful woman can gown herself. "Where are you going, my dear?" he inquired languidly. "Out," she responded archly. She passed through the door. He heard her step and then rustle of her skirts in the hall, and he heard the front door open and close. For some reason, not quite clear even to himself, it surprised him. She had never done a thing like that before. He walked to the front window and looked out. His wife went straight down the street and turned the first corner. After a time, he wandered away to the library to nurse an emotion he had never felt before. It was curiosity. Mrs. von Safford did not return home for luncheon, so he sat down alone. Afterwards, he wandered restlessly about the house for an hour or so, and then he went downtown. He appeared at home again just in time to dress for dinner. "Has Mrs. Van Safford returned?" was the first question of Baxter, who opened the door. "Yes, an hour and a half ago," he responded. "She's dressing." Mr. Von Safford ran up the stairs to his own apartments. At dinner, his wife was radiant, rosily radiant. The flush of perfect health was in her cheeks, and her eyes sparkled beneath her long lashes. Her husband brilliantly smiled. She brilliantly smiled upon her husband. To him, it was as if some great thing had been taken out of his life, leaving it desolate, then has suddenly returned. Unnamed emotions struggled within him, prompted by that curiosity of the morning, and a dozen questions hammered insistently for expression. But he repressed them gallantly, for this was his duly reward. "I had such a good time today," his wife exclaimed after the soup. "I called for Mrs. Braddock immediately after I left here, and we went together to the day's shopping, and we had luncheon downtown." "Oh, that was it?" Mr. Stafford laughed outright, from a vague sense of relief, which he could not have called by name. He toasted his wife silently, and lifting his glass. Her eyes sparkled at the compliment. The glass raised, he snapped the slender stems in his fingers, laughed again, and laid it aside. Mrs. Von Safford dimpled with sheer delight. "Oh, Van, you silly boy," she reproved softly, and she stroked the hand which was prosaically reaching for the salt. It was only a little while after dinner that Mr. Von Safford excused himself and started for the club, as usual. His wife followed him demurely to the door, and there, under the googling eyes of Baxter, he caught her in his arms and kissed her impetuously, fiercely even. It was a sudden outbreak of an impulsive nature, the sort of thing that makes a woman know she is loved. She thrilled at his touch and reached two white hands forward pleadingly. Then the door closed, and she stood staring down at the tip of her tiny boot with lowered lids, and her little melancholy droop at her shoulders and her mouth. It was after 10 o'clock when Mr. Van Safford awoke on the following morning. He had been at his club late, until after 2, and now drowsily permitted himself to be overcome again by the languid listlessness which is the heritage of late hours. At 10 minutes past 11, he appeared in the breakfast room. "Mrs. Van Safford has been down, I suppose?" he asked the maid. "Oh, yes, sir," she replied. "She's gone out." Mr. Van Safford lifted his brows inquiringly. "She was down a few minutes after 8 o'clock, sir," the maid exclaimed, "and hurried through her breakfast." "Did she leave any word?" "No, sir." "Be back at luncheon?" "She didn't say, sir." Mr. Van Safford finished his breakfast silently and thoughtfully. About noon, he too went out. One of the first persons he met downtown was Mrs. Blacklock, and she rushed forward to him with an outstretched hand. "I'm so glad to see you," she bubbled, for Mrs. Blacklock was that rare type that can bubble becomingly. "But where in the name of goodness is your wife? I haven't seen her for weeks. For weeks." "Haven't seen her for?" Mr. Von Safford repeated slowly. "No," Miss Blacklock assured him. "I can't imagine where she's keeping herself." Mr. Von Safford gazed at her in dumb bewilderment for a moment, and the lines about his mouth hardened a little, despite his efforts to control himself. I had the impression, he said deliberately, that you saw her yesterday and that you went shopping together.
Oh, goodness, no. It must have been 3 weeks since I've seen her.
Mr. Von Safford's fingers crossed slowly, fiercely, but his face relaxed a little, masking, with a slight smile, a turbulent rush of mingled emotions. She mentioned your name, he said at last calmly. Perhaps she said she was going to call you. I misunderstood her. He didn't remember the remainder of the conversation, but it was of no consequence at the moment. He had not misunderstood her, and he knew he had not. At last he found himself at his club, and their idle guesses and conjectures flowed through his brain in an unending stream. Finally, he arose grimly. I suppose I'm an ass, he mused. It doesn't amount to anything, of course, but... And he caught himself... And he sought to rid himself of distracting thoughts over a game of billiards. Instead, he only subjected himself to open derision for glaringly inaccurate play. Finally, he flung down the cue in disgust and strode away to the phone and called up his home. Is Mrs. Von Safford there? He inquired of Baxter. No, sir, she hasn't returned yet. Mr. Von Safford banged the telephone viciously as he hung up the receiver. At 6 o'clock, he returned home. His wife was still out. At 8:30, he sat down to dinner, alone. He did not enjoy it, indeed hardly taste it. Just as he finished, she came in with a rush of skirts and a lilt of laughter. He drew a long breath and set his teeth. You poor deserted dear, she sympathized laughingly. He started to say something, but two soft, clinging arms were about his neck, and a velvety cheek rested against his own. So he kissed her instead. And really, he was not at all to be blamed. She sighed happily and laid aside her hat and gloves. I simply couldn't get here any sooner, she explained poutingly as she glanced into his accusing eyes. I was out with Neil Blakesley on her big new touring car, and it broke down, and we had to send for a man to repair it. So... He did not hear the rest. He was staring into her eyes, steadily, inquiringly. Truth shone triumphant there. He could only believe her. Yet that other thing. She had not told him the truth. In her face, at least, he read uneasiness as he continued to stare. And for a moment, there was silence. What's the matter, Van? She inquired solicitously. Don't you feel well? He pulled himself together with a start, and for a time they chatted of inconsequential things as she ate. He watched her until she pushed the dessert plate aside, then casually, quite casually, I believe you said that you were going to call on Mrs. Blaylock tomorrow. She looked up quickly. Oh, no, she replied. I was with her all day yesterday, shopping. I said I had called on her. Mr. Von Safford rose suddenly, stood glaringly down at her for an instant, then, turning abruptly, left the house. Involuntarily she started up, then she sat down again and wept softly over her coffee. Mr. Von Safford seemed to have had a very definite purpose, for when he reached the club he went straight to a telephone booth and called Miss Blakesley over the wire. My wife said something about, he stammered lamely. Something about calling you tomorrow. Will you be in? Yes, and I shall be very glad to see her, came the reply. I'm dreadfully tired of staying cooped up here in the house, and I really was beginning to think all my friends had deserted me. Cooped up in the house, came the reply. Are you ill? I have been, came the reply. I'm better now, but I haven't been out of the house for more than a week. Indeed, remarked Mr. Von Safford sympathetically. I am awfully sorry to assure you. Then you haven't had a chance to try out your big new touring car.
Why, I haven't had any new touring car, said Miss Blakesley. I haven't any sort of car. Where did you get that idea?
Mr. Von Safford did not answer her. Rudely enough, he hung up the telephone and left the club with a face like marble. When he finally stopped walking, he was opposite of his house. For a moment, he stood looking at it as much as he had never seen it before. Then he turned and went back to the club. There was something of fright, of horror even, in his white face when he entered. As Mr. Von Safford did not go to bed that night, it was not surprising that his wife should find him in the breakfast room when she came down about 8 o'clock. She smiled, he stared at her in a curt good morning. Then came an ominous silence. She finished her breakfast, rose, and left the house without a word. He watched her from the window until she disappeared around the corner, just 4 doors below. Then, overcome with fears, suspicions, and hideous possibilities, he ran after her. She had not been out of his sight for more than half a minute when he reached the corner, and yet now she was gone. He looked on both sides of the street, up and down. There was no sign of her, not a woman in sight. He knew that she would not have had time to reach the street below, and in that case there were 2 obvious possibilities. One was that she had stepped into a waiting cab and had been driven away at full speed. Another that she had entered some house nearby. If so, which house? Whom did she know on this street? He turned the problem over in his mind several times, and then he was convinced that she had hurried away in a waiting cab. That emotion which had begun his curiosity was now a raging, turbulent torrent. On the following morning, Mrs. Van Safford came down for breakfast at 15 minutes to 8. She seemed a little tired, and there was a trace of tears about her eyes. Baxter looked at her curiously.
Has Mr. Van Stafford been down yet? She asked.
No, ma'am, he replied.
Did he come in at all last night?
Yes, ma'am. About 2:30 I let him in. He had forgotten his key. Now, as a matter of fact, at that particular moment, Mr. Von Safford was standing just around the corner, 4 doors down, waiting for his wife. Just what he intended to do when she appeared, he was not quite clear in his mind, but the affair had gone to a point where he felt that he must do something. So he waited impatiently and smoked innumerable cigars. 2 hours passed. He glanced around the corner. No one in sight. He strolled back to the house and met Baxter in the hall. Has Miss Van Stafford come down? He asked the servant. Yes, sir, was the reply. She went out more than an hour ago. Martha opened the door.
Please, sir,
she said.
There's a young gentleman having a fit in the reception room.
Professor Von Dusen, the thinking machine, turned away from his laboratory table and squinted at her aggressively. Her eyes were distended with nervous excitement, and her wrinkled hands twisted the apron she wore.
Having a fit?
Snapped the scientist.
Yes, sir. Dear me, how annoying, expostulated the man of achievements petulantly. Just what sort of fit is it? Epileptic, apoplectic, or merely a fit of laughter? That, sir, I don't know, Martha confessed helplessly. He's just a walking and a talking and pulling his hair, sir. What name? I forgot to ask, sir, apologized the aged servant. It surprised me to see a gentleman a-wiggling like that. He said, though, he's been to a police headquarters and Detective Mallory sent him here. The eminent logician dried his hands and started for the reception room. At the door he paused and peered in, with no knowledge of just what style of fit the visitor had chosen to have. He felt the necessity for caution.
What he saw was not alarming, merely a good-looking young man pacing back and forth across the room with quick, savage stride. His eyes were blazing, and his face was flushed with anger. It was Mr. von Safford. At the sight of the diminutive figure of the thinking machine, topped by an enormous yellow head, the young man paused, and his anger-distorted features relaxed into something closely approaching surprise.
"Well?"
demanded the professor curiously. "I beg your pardon," said Mrs. Safford with a slight start. "I had expected to find a different sort of person."
"Yes, I know," said the thinking man grumpily. "A man with a black mustache and big feet. Sit down."
Mr. von Safford sat down rather suddenly. It never occurred to anyone to do any other than obey the crabbed little scientist spoke. Then, with an incoherence which was thoroughly convincing, Mr. von Safford led before the thinking machine in detail those singular happenings which had so disturbed him. The professor leaned back in his chair, with fingertips pressed together, and listened to the end. "My mental condition, my suffering was such," explained Mr. von Safford in conclusion, "that I was proved to have my own satisfaction that she had twice misrepresented facts to me, willfully. I could have strangled her."
"That would have been a nice thing to do," remarked the scientist crisply. "You believe, then, that there may be another?"
"Don't say it," burst out the young man passionately. He rose. His face was dead white. "Don't say it," he repeated menacingly. The thinking machine was silent a moment. Then he glanced up with blazing eyes and cleared his throat.
"Did she never did such a thing before?"
he asked. "No, never."
Did she ever speculate?"
Mr. Van Safford sat down again. "Never," he responded positively. "She wouldn't know one stock from another."
"Has her own bank account?"
"Yes, nearly $400,000. That was her father's gift at her wedding. It was deposited in her name and has remained so. My own income is more than enough for our uses."
"You're a rich man, then?"
"My father left me nearly $2 million, was his reply. "But all this doesn't matter. What I want—"
"Wait a minute,"
interrupted the thinking machine testily. There was a long pause.
"You have never quarreled seriously?"
"Never a cross word," was the reply.
"Remarkable,"
commented the thinking machine ambiguously.
"How long have you been married?"
2 years. Last June."
"Most remarkable,"
supplemented the scientist. Mr. von Safford stared.
"How old are you?"
30.
"How long have you been 30?
6 months, since last May." There was a long pause. Mr. Van Safford plainly did not see the trend of the questioning.
"How old is your wife?"
demanded the scientist. 22, in January.
"She has never had any mental trouble of any sort?"
No, no.
"Have you any brothers or sisters?"
No.
"Has she?"
No. The thinking machine shot out the questions crustily, and Mr. Van Safford answered briefly. There was another pause, and the young man arose and paced back and forth with nervous energy. From time to time he glanced inquiringly at the pale, wizened face of the scientist. Several thin lines had appeared in the dome-like brow, and he was apparently oblivious to the other's presence.
"It's a most tangible, elusive affair,"
he commented at last, and the wrinkles deepened.
"It is, I may say, a problem without given quantity. Perfectly extraordinary."
Mr. von Safford seemed a little relieved to find someone express his own thoughts so accurately.
"You don't believe, of course," continued the scientist, "that there is anything criminal in—"
"Certainly not," the young man said violently.
"Yet the moment we pursue to a logical exclusion," pursued the other, "we are more than likely to uncover something which is, to put it mildly, not pleasant."
Mr. von Safford's face was perfectly white. His hands were clenched desperately. Then the loyalty to the woman he loved flooded his heart. "It's nothing of that kind," he exclaimed, and yet his own heart misgave him. My wife is the dearest, noblest, sweetest woman in the world, and yet...
Yet you are jealous of her,
interrupted the thinking machine.
If you are so sure of her, why annoy me with your troubles?
The young man read perhaps a deeper meaning than the thinking machine had intended, for he started forward impulsively. The professor continued to squint at him impersonally, but did not change his position.
All young men are fools, he went on blandly, and I may add to the most that the old ones are too. But now the question is, what purpose can your wife have in acting as she did, and in misrepresenting those acts to you? Of course, we must spy on her to find out. The answer may be one that may wreck your future happiness. It may be, I say. I don't know. Do you still want the answer?
I want to know, burst Mr. Van Sanford harshly. I shall go mad unless I know. The thinking machine continued to squint at him, with almost a gleam of pity in his eyes. Almost, but not quite. And the habitually irritated voice was in no way softened when he gave some explicit and definite instructions.
Go on about your affairs, he commanded. Let things go as they are. Don't quarrel with your wife. Continue to ask your questions, because if you don't, she'll suspect that you suspect. Report to me any change of her conduct. It's a very singular problem. Certainly have never had another like it.
The thinking machine accompanied him to the door, and closed it behind him.
I have never seen a man in love, he mused, who wasn't in trouble.
And with this broad philosophical conclusion, he went to the phone. Half an hour later, Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, entered the laboratory where the scientist sat in deep thought.
Mr. Hatch, he began, without preliminary, did you ever happen to hear of Mr. and Mrs. Van Safford?
Well, rather, responded the reporter with quick interest. He's a well-known clubman, worth millions, high in society and all that, and she's one of the most beautiful women I ever saw. She was a Miss Porter before marriage.
It's wonderful the memories you newspapermen have, observed the scientist. You know her personally?
Hatch shook his head.
You must find someone who knows her well, commanded the thinking machine. A girlfriend, for instance, one who might be in her confidence. Learn from her why Miss Van Safford leaves her house every morning at 8 o'clock, and then tells her husband she has been with someone that we know she hasn't seen. She has done this every day for 4 days. Your absurdity may prevent a divorce.
Hatch pricked up his ears.
Also, find out just what sort of illness Miss Neil Blakeslee has recently suffered. That's all.
An hour later, Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, called on Miss Gladys Beckman, a young society woman who was an intimate of Miss Van Safford's before the latter's marriage. Without feeling that he was dallying with the truth, Hatch informed her that he called on her behalf of Mr. Van Safford. She began to smile. He laid the case before her emphatically, earnestly, and with great detail. The more he explained, the more pleasantly she smiled. It made him uncomfortable, but he struggled on to the end. "I'm glad she did it," exclaimed Miss Beckman. I couldn't believe she would." Then a sudden gust of laughter which left Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, with a feeling that he was being imposed upon. It continued for a full minute, hearty, rippling, musical laugh. Hatch grinned sheepishly, then without an excuse Miss Beekman rose and left the room. In the hall there came a fresh burst, and Hatch heard it dying away in the distance. "Well," he muttered grimly, "I'm glad I was able to amuse her." Then he called upon Mrs. Francis, a young matron whom he had cause to believe was also favored by Miss Van Stafford's friendship. He laid the case before her, and she laughed. Then Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, began to get mule-headed about it. He visited 8 other women who were known to be on friendly terms with Miss Van Safford. 6 of them intimated that he was an impertinent, prying, inquisitive person, and the other 2 laughed. Hatch paused and stroked his fevered brow. "Here's a corking good joke on somebody," he told himself. "I'm beginning to think it's me." Whereupon he took his troubles to Professor von Dusen. That distinguished gentleman listened in pained surprise to the simple recital of what Hatch had not been able to learn. The spotted wrinkles on his forehead assumed the relative importance to the canals in Mars.
"It's astonishing,"
he declared restfully. Yes, it struck me so, agreed the reporter. The thinking machine was silent for a long time. The watery blue eyes were turned upward, and the slender white fingers pressed tip to tip. Finally, he made up his mind as to the next step.
"There seems only one thing to do," he said, "and I won't ask you to do that."
"What is it?" demanded the reporter.
"To watch Mrs. Van Safford and see where she goes."
"I wouldn't have done it before, but now I will," Hatch responded promptly. The bulldog in him was aroused. "I want to see what the joke is." It was 10 o'clock next evening when Hatch called to make a report. He seemed a little weary and tremendously disgusted. "I've been right behind her all day," he explained, "from 8 o'clock this morning until 20 minutes past 9 tonight, when she reached home. And if the Lord will forgive me—"
"What did she do?"
interrupted Professor von Dusen impatiently. "Well," said Hutch, and grinned as he drew out his notebook. "She walked eastward from her house to the first corner, turned, walked another block, took a downtown car, and went straight to the public library. There she read a Henry James book until 15 minutes till 1, and then she went to see a luncheon at a restaurant. I also had luncheon. Then we went to the North End on a car. She got there after she wandered around aimlessly all afternoon, nearly. At 10 minutes to 4, she gave a quarter to a crippled boy. He bit it to see if it was good. She found it was, and bought cigarettes with it. 4:30, she left the North End and went to a big department store. If there's anything there she didn't price, I can't remember it. She bought a pair of shoelaces. The store closed at 6, so she went to dinner at another restaurant. I also had dinner. We left there at 7:30 and went past the public library. She read until 9 o'clock, and then she went home. Phew," he concluded. The thinking machine had listened with growing and obvious disappointment in his face. He seemed to cast down the recital that Hatch began to feel guilty. "I couldn't help it, you know," the reporter said by way of apology. "That's what she did."
"She didn't speak to anyone?"
"Not a soul but clerks, waiters, and library attendants."
"She didn't give a note to anyone or receive a note?"
"No."
"Did she seem to have any purpose at all in anything she did?"
"No, the impression she gave me was that she was killing time." Professor von Dusen was silent for several minutes.
"I think perhaps," he began.
But what he thought Hatch did not learn, for he was sent away with additional instructions. Next morning found him watching the front of the Van Safford house again. Mrs. Van Safford came out at 7 minutes past 8 o'clock and walked rapidly eastward. She turned the first corner and went on, still rapidly, to a corner of the alley. There she paused and took a quick look behind her and went in. Hatch was some distance back and ran forward just in time to see her skirts trailing into the door. Here's something anyhow, he told himself with grim satisfaction. He walked down the alley to the door. It was like all the other doors along that led to a back hall of a house, and was intended for the use of delivery wagons. When he examined the door, he scratched his chin thoughtfully. Then came utter bewilderment. An amazing sense of hopeless insanity, for there, staring at him in the doorplate, was the name Von Safford. She had merely come out the front door and gone in at the back. Hatch started to rap and ask some questions, then changed his mind and walked again to the front of the house and the steps up. "Is Miss Von Safford in?" he inquired of Baxter, who opened the door. "No, sir. She went out a few minutes ago." Hatch stared at him coldly a minute, then walked away. "Now this is a singularly savory kettle of fish," he soliloquized. "She's either gone back into the house without his knowledge, or else he has been bribed. And then he took the story to Professor von Dusen. The imperturbable man of science listened to the end, and then arose.
Oh,
He said 3 times, which was interesting to Hatch in that it showed the end was in sight, but it was not at all illuminating. He was still floundering. The thinking machine started to an adjoining room, then turned back.
By the way, Mr. Hatch, he answered, did you happen to find out what was the matter with Miss Blakely?
By George, I forgot that, returned the reporter ruefully.
Never mind, I'll find out.
At 11 o'clock, Hutchison Hatch and the thinking machine called at the Van Safford home. Mr. Van Safford in person received them, and there was a gleam of hope in his face at the sight of the diminutive scientist. Hatch was introduced then.
You don't know of any other Van Saffords in this block, began the scientist.
There's no other family in the city, was the reply. Why?
Is your wife in now?
No, she went out this morning as usual.
Now, Mr. Van Safford, I'll tell you how you may bring a match to the end, and understand it all at once. Go upstairs to the wife's apartment. They're probably locked, and call her. She won't answer, but she'll hear you. Then tell her you understand it all and that you're sorry. She'll hear that, and that alone is what she's been waiting to hear for some time. When she comes out, bring her downstairs. Believe me, I should be delighted to meet so clever a woman.
Mr. Van Safford was looking at him as if he was doubting his sanity. Really, he said coldly, what sort of child's play is this?
It's the only way you'll ever coax her out of her room, snapped Professor Van Dusen belligerently, and you'd better do it gracefully.
Are you serious? Demanded the other.
Perfectly serious, was a crabbed rejoinder. She has taught you a lesson that you'll remember for some time. She has been merely going out the front door every day and coming back in the back, and every day... She has merely been going out the front door every day and coming back in the back, of necessity to a full knowledge of her cook and her maid. And that is what she did the day you ran after her and she disappeared.
Mr. Van Safford listened in amazement. Why did she do it?
Why?
reported Professor Van Dusen.
That's for you to answer. A little less time at your club in the evenings, and a little less of a selfish amusement, so that you can pay attention to a beautiful woman who was, previous to her marriage at least, been accustomed to constant attention. Would solve a little domestic problem. You've spent every evening at your club for months, and she has been here alone probably a great part of that time. And your own selfishness, you've never thought of her. She gave you a reason to think of her.
Suddenly, Mr. Van Safford turned and ran out of the room. They heard him as he took the stairs, 2 at a time. By George, remarked Hatch, that's a silly ending to a cracking good mystery, isn't it? 10 minutes later, Mr. and Mrs. Van Safford entered the room. Her pretty face was suffused with color. He was frankly outrageously happy. There were mutual introductions. It was perfectly dreadful of Mr. Van Safford to call on you gentlemen into this affair, Mrs. Van Safford apologized charmingly. Really, I feel very much ashamed of myself for...
There is no consequence, madam, Professor Van Dusen assured her. It's the first opportunity I've ever had to study a woman's mind. It was not at all logical, but it was very, very instructive. I may add that it was effective, too.
He bowed low and, turning, picked up his hat. But your fee, suggested Mr. Van Safford. Professor Van Dusen squinted at him sourly.
Oh, yes, my fee, he mused. That will be $5,000.
5,000 what? Exclaimed Mr. Van Safford.
$5,000, repeated the scientist.
Why, man, it's perfectly absurd to talk... Mrs. Van Safford laid one white hand on her husband's arm. He glanced at her, and she smiled radiantly. Don't you think I'm worth it, then? She asked archly. He wrote the check. The professor inscribed his name across the back in a crabbed little hand and passed it on to Hatch.
Please hand that to some charitable organization, he directed. It was as good an excellent lesson, Mrs. Van Safford. Good day.
Professor von Dusen, scientist, and Hudson Hatch, reporter, walked along side by side for 2 blocks without speaking. The reporter broke the silence. "Why did you want to know what was the matter with Miss Blakesley?" he asked.
Her name was mentioned, and I still wanted to know if she was really ill, or was merely attempting to mislead Mr. Von Safford, was the reply. She had a touch of grippe. I got that by the phone. I also learned that Mr. Von Safford's club habits by the phone of his club.
And those women who left, what was the joke?
The fact that they laughed made me see that the affair was not a serious one. They were intimate friends with whom the wife had evidently discussed doing just what she did. All sorts of possibilities were suggested to me, but everything considered in this case, the facts could only have been that the logic developed them. I imagined the true state of the affairs from your report of Miss Van Safford's day of wandering. When I knew that she went to the back door of her own house, I saw the solution. I saw it, Mr. Hatch.
And the scientist paused and shook a long finger at the reporter's face.
Because 2 and 2 are always 4, not sometimes, but all the time.
Okay.
Professor Von Dusen is a very interesting person. And I hate the fact that when I do his voice, I speed up and start stumbling over words, and make it sound completely illogical.
But anyway, I don't think I'm going to be able to get a third story, because each one of these stories has taken me roughly 45 minutes. Which is fine, I guess. And it's, with stumbling and everything else. So, you think we should raid someone? Who's on? Oh, excuse me. Let's see. Oh. Ah, well, there's someone we can raid. We are going to go ahead and raid another reader, Hart Griffin, who's still working in Don Quixote. Unless, of course, you want to suggest someone else. I do give you guys pretty much open chances to pick someone. I don't know. What do you think? Anyone? Fry? No, I haven't raided Dusk for a while. Yeah, let's raid Dusk. And I'm going to give you a different raid message. We're going to use this one. If you can. Oh, hold on. Okay. Let's do this one. Okay? Okay. So, yeah. I will see you over there. And hopefully I'll see you tomorrow for some Friday Night Fairy Tales. Sound good? Yes, no, maybe. I'm doing it anyway. Where's my... Okay, there it is. See ya.
In the quiet